Welcome everybody. Today is Tuesday, February the 8th, and on Tuesdays we have Mr. Dwoskin presenting his In the Headlines lecture series. Mr. Dwoskin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Angela. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. Welcome. I'd like to start today's class with a correction, apology. I had done a discussion on the Amnesty International condemnation of Israel as an apartheid country or state. And we had one very attentive listener who said that the report came out from Amnesty International. And I said, no, it was from the United Nations. And indeed, it was from Amnesty International. And there's a similar so-called investigation of Israel being done by the United Nations. And I thought that was the one. But in a way, it's sort of two parallel studies, each coming to the same conclusion, and I just mixed one up with the other one. So that's that. So for today's talk, I picked sort of three subjects that are really, in the news and in the headlines as sort of current events, like like for real, rather than picking one subject and going on in full detail about it. And the first subject I picked was about the Winter Olympics, because they're on TV, and for people who are interested in it, it's certainly a most interesting, fascinating, and fun thing to look at. And in a certain sense, the Olympic Games are really a reflection of the world at large. The tensions which exist in the world get translated into tensions in the Olympic Games. The Olympic Games have always been used by the countries who participate them as a sort of showcase of power, a showcase of prestige, and a kind of competition between countries. So obviously the athletes compete against each other, but since the Olympics are a kind of an international event and international flags are present, and each country walks into the stadium holding their flag. So it's a kind of we'll call it a competition between countries using athletes as their representatives. In a certain sense, it's always been that way. That's never been changed, even though the so-called Olympic ideal is that we're all, all people are brothers and sisters, and sport is something that unites us, and sport is something that's not political, sport is something that's not national. In theory, that's the way it works, but in theory, that's the way it's supposed to be. But in practice, of course, it has never been that way, and it still isn't that way. The Olympic Games themselves evolve as society evolves. So in other words, although the Olympics were first instituted in 1896, the first modern Olympics, it was inspired by the Olympic Games in ancient Greece. But so much has changed since 1896 that it's barely recognizable, except for opening and closing ceremonies. All the rest of it is kind of changed so much from the very beginning till now. The Winter Olympics were introduced later on in the 1920s as a way of allowing winter sports to be presented, as a way of allowing countries who are northern countries to excel at something. And it proved to be quite popular because a lot of the Winter Olympics are very crowd-pleasing, especially figure skating, especially so the hockey, some of the other sports are really quite ideally suited for television and for live reporting. And so the Winter Olympics have proved to be quite a popular sporting event, not as popular as the Summer Olympics. The reason being that there's so much fewer people and countries competing in the Winter Olympics compared to the Summer Olympics. When the Winter Olympics started, it really emphasized kind of, I would say, sports for the elites. In other words, things like skiing and figure skating were sports practiced by wealthy people in their societies, certainly not open to the average population, the average working population, who couldn't afford the time or the equipment to buy so as to participate in these sports. It was kind of an upper class idea. You know, just as in the Summer Olympics, the equestrian events are an upper class sport that was translated into the Olympics. You know, although running was something that anyone could do, stick on a pair of running shoes and start running. But for something like skiing and figure skating, you know, you need the time, the venue time, the travel time, the equipment to buy. It was originally really an upper class kind of pastime. The holding the Olympic Games was always a matter of pride and nationalism. So at first, there was a lot of competition between countries to be able to hold the games. And as time passed on, this competition got to be less and less because the cost of holding these games are enormous. And the payback for an event which lasted maybe 2 weeks or so, or 3 weeks, wasn't really enough to compensate for the huge outlay of costs. So the outlay of costs are to build the stadiums, to build the roads getting to the stadiums, to build the venues themselves, you know, the ski jumps, you know, and all those other things that they need. And many countries felt it wasn't worth it for the little time that the Olympics would be taking place. The Olympics were almost never profitable in the sense that the Olympic Committee sponsoring the Games never made enough money in revenues from ticket sales and from TV broadcasting rights and from sales of you know, souvenirs and stuff like that. They never made enough money to cover their costs. But countries felt that the money generated by tourists coming to the Games and spent elsewhere, and the goodwill generated by good publicity was worth the effort to spend the money on staging the Games. Nowadays, of course, this calculation is even more, let's say, one-sided. You might remember when Montreal held the Olympic Games, it took us 30 years to pay off the debt for the Olympic Stadium. Many of the venues that get built turn out to be white elephants. In other words, it can't be used for anything else. And of course, since COVID started, the Olympics are even more costly because there's no spectators coming, there's no tourists coming, there's no tickets sold, there's no souvenirs sold, there's no sort of revenue associated with it except for the broadcast rights. And even the broadcast rights are something which is going down because major networks realize that they're not as profitable as they used to be. There's so many more choices that are available to TV watchers than watching the Olympics live on TV, that they are bidding a lot less money for the rights than they used to. So all in all then, the Olympics as a kind of a world, a kind of event where, you know, for 2 weeks in the world, everyone would shut off what they're doing and just watch the Games. That's not something that's happening anymore. In order to increase the popularity on TV, in order to get new viewers watching, all kinds of new sports have been introduced in the Olympics, which never existed before. I think sports have been invented that never existed before. All the kind of snowboarding and the jumps, the snowboards going down different types of hills and going over ski jumps, all of that was done for TV because it's so spectacular to see people soaring up in the air and then trying to land on 2 feet or not landing at all. The sort of speed skating, you know, the short track speed skating where the skaters bump into each other and they all go flying down in one pile. The sport where you've got, let's say, 4 or 5 skiers all starting at the same time and running down the same course and trying to avoid each other and seeing who finishes first. All these are brand new events which were made for TV. You know, other sports which used to be important in the Olympic Games, you know, something like, let's say, long distance speed skating, they're still there, but who's going to watch somebody speed skate for 10 kilometers? It's like, you know, watching clothes dry. Or, you know, if they're a 30-kilometer cross-country ski, I mean, this thing takes 2 hours and more to finish. So you can't have a camera on one skier for 2.5 hours. So obviously, or you know, the cross-country skiing with the pistol shooting, these are things which never appeal to the sort of mass American viewing customer, and how these are things which have been de-emphasized in order to stick to the spectator-friendly sports. Figure skating, of course, is always spectator-friendly because it's so it's so beautiful to watch. It's interesting to watch, and it doesn't take a long time to complete. And so something like that has always been of interest to TV viewers. Just you know, as a side note, all of this snowboarding stuff and all those tricks and things, you know where they all started. They all started in Quebec. They all started by Quebecers who decided to do something else but ski down a hill. And they took a snowboard, you know, which was adapted from a surfboard, and you know, fixed it up. And Quebecers were the first ones to participate in that sport. And at the very beginning, they were the best ones at that sport, you know, until it caught on in all the rest of the world. Now, another such as interesting change is the number of different countries competing in the Winter Olympics. So before it was strictly, we'll go back to certainly the pre-Second World War days, or even going around up to around 1960. It was only the Nordic countries, parts of Northern Europe, Russia, and Canada and the US, you know, maybe 15 or 20 countries total, which competed in the Winter Olympics, and which of course shared out all the medals from that. Since the world has opened up so much, we now have a whole bunch of different countries competing. You might remember that movie, The Blade Runners, about the Jamaican bobsled team. Before, you know, let's say we'll call them marginal winter countries like Cyprus or Lebanon, which do have snow, but not a lot of it. These countries were considered exotic participants in the Winter Olympics, but, you know, at least they have snow. Today, if you were watching the opening ceremonies, believe it or not, I think I saw, and I know I saw, not that I think, I know I saw, the flags of Haiti and Saudi Arabia competing in the Winter Olympics. Now you tell me when there was ever snow in Haiti and Saudi Arabia, and I would have to say never. And believe it or not, they have competitors in the Winter Olympics. So, you know, what explains it? The desire to walk into a stadium holding your flag seems to have a lot of a lot of sway for patriotism in those home countries. The fact that people move around so much in this world these days means that you could certainly have a Haitian living in Montreal who learns how to ski and who learns to ski well enough not to win anything, but at least to make a half decent showing in the Olympics. And the same goes to Saudi Arabia. They have some skier. Certainly these people have no abilities to practice in their home countries, but they have citizenship, and that's enough to allow them to be selected by the Olympic Committee from these different countries to participate in the Winter Olympics. We know that this big controversy in China, they've got two American born athletes representing them. One is Miss Gu and one is Miss Yi. One was, of course, the ski jumper or board jumper, and the other one is a figure skater. One turned out to be a hero and one turned out to be a zero. The Chinese newspapers have questioned and condemned the American-born skater for falling twice, and saying, well, why did the Chinese Olympic team pick an American instead of picking a Chinese person? But notice how they never criticized Miss Gu, who was also, born and raised in San Francisco and learned to figure skate in America. And they never criticized the Chinese Olympic Committee for picking her because she just won a gold medal. So, this sort of importation of athletes to represent countries that they don't come from or weren't born in isn't a new feature. It's been going on now for a long time, especially you noticed in the Summer Olympics where the United Arab Emirates and other wealthy countries have all kinds of athletes competing for them. Athletes who have a very marginal, let's say, connection to those countries. In the case of the two Chinese athletes, their parents were born in China. At least one parent of each of them was born in China. They both speak Chinese, and so they make a more credible representation of China for those athletes. The Olympics also, as I was saying before, they kind of reflect what's going on in the world as a whole. And sort of before the 1960s, certainly in the Winter Olympics, as I said, there were no Asian countries at all who were, winning any kind of events. And now, because Asia has become so much more wealthy and so much more powerful, countries like China, of course, Korea, and Japan have become prime competitors in the Winter Games, whereas before, you would only see white faces among the participants in the Winter Olympics. So this is a kind of an internationalization of the Olympics, as by the way it was in the Summer Olympics, because it was only the European countries and America and Canada and Australia who had any kind of showing in the Summer Olympic Games. And of course, since the 1960s, the whole world has piled in to compete in the Summer Olympics. And so many of the top athletes from Jamaica and Kenya, the greatest runners in the world, for example, have come from those countries. And so it really was a kind of a democratization of sport, which happened since the 1960s. One of the other big changes is that the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire meant that the sort of fix that was in the Olympic judging kind of went away. So when the Soviets were in power, they were such a strong country in terms of sport that in terms of judges of the sport, they nominated many judges from their own countries, and these judges automatically were biased and prejudiced in favor of the Soviet Union itself in the first place, and also of its allies, the Eastern European countries in the second place. But that changed, as well as the change about the definition of amateurs, because in those days, you might recall, all of you may remember that the Olympic rules said that only amateurs could participate in the games. And by definition, the Soviet Union said we only have amateurs, we have no professional athletes, because we're a communist country, we don't pay athletes to do anything. Therefore, that gave them so much of an extra advantage, because all of the athletes who they sent were not amateurs. They were all paid by the state, but their classifications were student, that kind of thing, and so they got away with it. This year, you should know, of course, that for for hockey, whereas previously NHL players were allowed to play in the Olympics, this time the NHL decided that none of its players should be able to play for reasons of catching COVID and for reasons of risking injury and not being able to play back in the NHL. The whole travel issue with COVID, the whole how COVID has affected the games is just something else. Such a big change. Generally speaking, there is a correlation between the number of medals won and the wealth and size of a country. So, in other words, if you have a country with a large population like China or Russia or the United States, chances are some of the people from those countries will sort of rise up and excel. But you also need the wealth of the country to support these people and give them all the training and facilities they need. We have examples where you have a small country that's wealthy, like Norway, that will do well in the Olympics. You have a large country like India, which is large but poor, and they don't do well in the Olympics. And then you have countries like the United States and China, which are kind of both large and at least moderately wealthy. And those two countries have been supplying the bulk of winning athletes in the Summer Olympics and even in the Winter Olympics. The Olympics are also part of politics. So, we've had boycotts by the Soviet Union, boycotted the games at one point and pulled out all their athletes because of the US had done the same thing the previous Olympics when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. So the US boycotted the games, and the Soviets counter boycotted the next time around. So this time, as you probably all know, that there is a diplomatic boycott of the games, meaning that the Western countries are sending athletes, but not sending leaders of the country to visit and to welcome the games as a kind of a protest against China. The protest is rooted in supposedly the treatment of the Uyghur minority in China, which I believe is a complete red herring. The treatment of Hong Kong by the heavy hand of China, which I believe is not a red herring. and the treatment of bullying its neighbors in the South China Sea, which is also not a red herring. In other words, I'm saying that you have two good reasons for doing it, and the third reason, which is the one that they seem to cite the most, hardly anybody in the whole world cares about the Uyghurs, and it's just a kind of a way of trying to embarrass China, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, so that's a kind of a just a little kind of on the surface summary about the Olympic Games and the Winter Olympics, and at least what we should say is the good thing about it, besides the allowing sports athletes and elites to compete at a world level, is that it does bring together people. Unfortunately, because of COVID, there has in China they have the policy of restricting all contact between the people of China and the athletes, which normally it doesn't happen. The athletes are kept, in a sort of hermetically sealed village. Any athlete that's tested positive is sent off to the wilderness. So it is in a most unusual games in that sense. And COVID has had its influence on the Olympics like it's had its influence everywhere else. Some athletes haven't been able to compete because they tested positive. And China is trying its hardest to isolate the country itself from COVID. And they took a big risk in sort of having the games take place at all, because there are still thousands of both athletes and coaches and other members of the Olympic teams coming into China. And as much as they're tested before they get there, and as much as they're isolated, if they do test positive, there's always going to be some sort of contact, between the native Chinese people and potentially someone carrying COVID in from abroad. So it's a risk that they were taking, but they're trying to minimize it as much as possible. And the time will tell if they've succeeded in doing this. So let me just check my work. So that's my presentation about that. I think what I'll do is I'll go on to my other subjects, and then we'll do questions about any of the ones. And I have to speak about the political event of the week in Canada, which is kicking Mr. O'Toole out of the leadership of the Conservative Party. That certainly is a kind of a political highlight of the week. It made the international press. It was mentioned on CNN. It was mentioned in the BBC. And the reason for doing this is that the Conservative members were dissatisfied with his election loss, last time around, and dissatisfied with the kind of lack of strong inspirational leadership that he could have taken to let's say, mobilize sympathy on the right wing for to use the trucking boycott or the trucking occupation of the parliament, that the right wing of the party wasn't sufficiently impressed with how he did not go out to the truckers and to express strong support for their actions. And so these things taken together meant that a majority of the members of parliament voted to kick him out, and kick him out they did. I think a couple of facts should be mentioned here, and that is that in the last election, the Conservatives under O'Toole won more votes than the Liberals under Trudeau. Because of our system, a lot of the votes were sort of piled up in areas that he won anyway, but the number of votes that he needed to win the whole election, in other words, if you took enough votes from the close ridings and switched the votes, he was only 120,000 votes short of winning a majority if, you know, key votes were switched in key constituencies. Now that number is the smallest number, smaller than Scheer had, or even that Harper had when they lost elections. In other words, he didn't lose by much, even though he won the most seats. Even you know, if you took number of votes in key areas that he lost, the ones that he lost by the least amount, he was only 120,000 votes short of winning a majority. The problem with our electoral system is that it is what's called a first past the post system, or a parliamentary system. And it doesn't matter how much you win a seat by, you win it by one vote or you win it by 100,000 votes, it's still only one seat. And in the case of Mr. O'Toole, he won seats in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta by huge amounts, and some parts of BC by huge amounts. But in all of the closer constituencies in the populated provinces of Ontario and Quebec, he didn't win enough votes to be able to win enough seats. And so that's why he ended up with more votes than Trudeau, but with fewer seats. The rebellion in the Conservative Party also reflects the kind of divisions in the conservative parties all around the world, meaning in Europe and the United States, between a kind of a hard right-wing, nationalist, xenophobic, racist almost beliefs of some of the most strong and active members of the party, and a much more moderate, small c conservative wing, which appeals to sort of so-called conservative economic values of not spending too much and not taxing too much, a respect for traditional values as far as some of the social issues are concerned. This division is present in the Republican Party in the United States, and apparently it's also present in the Conservative Party of Canada. So there is a kind of a Trumpist wing in that party. And to go to the trucking protests, you see that, you know, there is a strong kind of right-wing element in that protest as well. So it's not something that doesn't exist in Canada, and it's not something that doesn't exist in the Conservative Party. And sort of these elements are so, let's say, outspoken that they were able to use the frustrations that they had to get rid of Mr. O'Toole. Now, should this wing dominate in the Conservative Party, it will for sure condemn that party to losing elections in the future, because there just aren't enough Canadians who support those kind of ideas. The Conservative Party has been divided before. Remember, the Reform Party that Preston Manning from Alberta started started it as a kind of an opposition or a protest to the Conservative Party, which wasn't conservative enough. And of course, you know, proceeded to lose elections one after another. When the Reform Party and the Conservative Party united under Mr. Harper, that's when they were able to actually win an election in Canada. So Mr. O'Toole represents a ex-urban area in Toronto, in other words, the Durham region. In other words, he represents the biggest province in the country, the province where the Conservatives need to win votes. And if he's replaced by a Western a leader, then the appeal to sort of Western nationalism or Western separatism will get stronger, but that's not where the conservatives need to win votes. This kind of movement, though, is shadowed or reflected in Europe also. There's a right-wing kind of xenophobic, anti-immigration, anti-Muslim feeling among many people in Europe, and where this is translated into political parties and political support. They have won seats in their parliaments representing those kind of ideas. However, because the systems in Europe are different, in other words, they have proportional representation. They have a system where the number of votes you get, the percentage of the votes that you get in an election is equal to the percentage of seats you get in their parliaments. For example, in Germany, in Denmark, and Holland, and Sweden, they do have a proportional representation element, which allows right-wing voters of the extreme right, we'll call it, to get represented. But Canada, we don't have that system. So the idea of our system, one of the benefits of it is that it forces political parties to be more moderate in order to capture the greatest number of voters who are in the middle. Now, in the United States, though, because the electorate as a whole is moved to the right, it's enabled more right-wing candidates to succeed, especially because in the United States, there has been a kind of a split between moderates and well, we'll call them between liberals and conservatives, let's say, where geographically they live in different places. And so they are able to run candidates, even extreme ones, and win because of this separation of peoples where they live. And there's even been talk about people moving from, say, California, which is a liberal place, to more conservative places by conservative Californians in order to be kind of more attached to their neighbors, and vice versa. So, that's the way it goes. Now, these, even in Canada, these feelings, I would say, represent somewhere between 10 and 15% of the voters. But in our system, or a system like in France, it won't get you very far. In France, you have to win a seat by 50%, or obviously you have to win the presidency by 50%. And it's very unlikely that an extremist would be able to gather 50% of the vote. I was just reading an article in the American press saying that more than 90% of the seats in the House of Representatives today are non-competitive. And they're non-competitive because the seats have been drawn in a way to give advantage to the party in power in the state. In other words, I've spoken about this before, to kind of isolate all the opponents into one seat so that all the other seats are won by the party in power. This is not a good sign for democracy, because to choose a candidate in a seat which you know you're going to win, the most radical candidate who appeals to the most strongly committed party members is going to get the nomination and will win the seat because 90% plus are non-competitive. And so this is doesn't bode well for a kind of democracy. In the national elections coming up, let's say in the US in 2024, it may well be that because the elections are held state by state, the close states, if the Republicans pick Trump again or another kind of right-wing candidate, because of changes in demographics, because of younger people voting and older people dying off in the meantime, because of a greater Hispanic representation, it may well be that the Republicans could box themselves in by picking Trump again to run again. But this kicking out of Mr. O'Toole will result in certainly in changes in the Conservative Party. And you may remember, I'll just say again, that Mr. O'Toole spoke French really quite well, considering that he was from Ontario. And the right wing is sorely tempted in the Conservative Party to pick somebody who doesn't speak French. And, it's been a kind of an unwritten rule in politics going, certainly back a long ways, for the leaders of both parties to be bilingual. Certainly, Stephen Harper was I admired him so much for learning French, and for using it, in a serviceable way in front of the microphones. Brian Mulroney, of course, was a bilingual Quebecer prime minister, successful, partly because of that. And Mr. O'Toole spoke French reasonably well enough. So if the sort of, we'll call him the kind of extremist wing of the Conservatives pick a candidate who doesn't speak French, it's sort of saying, well, to Quebec, well, we don't need your votes and we're going to write you off. Remember that, the Conservatives still have a medium strong backing in Quebec. They did win, I think, 10 seats in Quebec out of 78. So it's not nothing. And, if they move too far to the right, they would risk some of those seats. So interesting is that there already exists in Canada a right-wing party to the right of the Conservatives, and that is the PPC, the Populist Party, Popular Party of Canada, led by Mr. Bernier. And the last polls that he got 5% in the last election, by the way. And the last polls show that he's now up to 13%, which is, obviously a jump of over 200%. And not enough to win an election, but certainly in some places, possibly enough to take votes away from the Conservatives to allow another candidate to win that particular seat. So let's talk a little bit about this trucking protest, because it's been announced worldwide. The whole world knows nothing about Canada at all, but they know that the trucks are blocking roads in Ottawa primarily, but also in Winnipeg, Vancouver, Toronto, Quebec City. The truckers have brought their trucks and parked them wherever they could to sort of block traffic and to call attention to themselves and their cause. So what's their cause? The cause is that the government passed a regulation saying that in order to cross the US border in a truck, you have to be vaccinated. Now, we all know that traveling anywhere, you have to have proof of vaccination. So certainly to get on a plane, to get on a train, you have to show your proof of vaccination. What makes this different is that the truckers are saying, well, look, we're not endangering the public by being unvaccinated because we're just sitting in our own truck. Yet, to cross the border with a car, in your own private car, you do have to be vaccinated and be ready to show your proof. So that argument doesn't quite follow. The other thing is that Canadians, by and large, are vaccinated, including truckers. We are now over 80% fully vaccinated of people over age 5, and over 90% vaccinated of people over, I think, age 50. So, like, what kind of principle is it that they are trying to uphold? So what they say is we uphold the idea of freedom, freedom of choice. We don't want the government to tell us what to do. We don't want the government to take away our rights. And it's a kind of they're trying to display the argument as kind of a, David and Goliath type of argument, where the truckers are David and the government is Goliath. And it feeds into the same sentiment of being fed up with COVID restrictions, being fed up with mask wearing, being fed up with the whole situation. As we know now, 2 years on, that many people, everyone around the world is fed up with this whole situation. And they are also trying to show their disenchantment with the government, with Prime Minister Trudeau in particular, feeling that he is erring on the side of caution and that he's making their lives unnecessarily complicated. So that's part of the protest. Another part of the protest is Americans who are Trump-type supporters looking for venues to express their opinions. And many of the truckers who are there, I don't know how many, but many of them are Americans. And certainly the money coming to support them definitely is partly coming from America also. So the protesters are kind of a mixture of libertarians, people who believe they should do whatever they want, nobody telling them what to do, a mixture of anti-vaxxers, people who just don't believe in vaccinations, right-wing militants, racists, xenophobes, this sort of jetsam and flotsam that are always hunkering around these fringes of society, looking to cause trouble. People who just like causing trouble for any reason, getting into a fight for any reason, so long as it's a fight. It's a mixture of all these different kinds of people. For all we know, Russia, and I'm not saying this because I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me to hear that Russia is in some way or another funding, causing trouble, just to divide the population in the Western world. They certainly have done that in a lot of other type operations. The money, where does the money come from to support these people? Well, there was a GoFundMe campaign which raised somewhere close to $1 million. No, was it $1 million? No, I think it was more. And then because the government complained and GoFundMe said, no, we're not going to give out the funds that these people collected. And so they went to another Christian site, which they were able to collect funds, like I say, coming from all around the world for this type of thing. The coverage is worldwide, so all around the world, and all the press is covering this event. It was on Fox News. Fox News said that 3 million people came to, Fox News said that 3 million people came to demonstrate in Ottawa to support the truckers. Now, the whole city of Ottawa has 1 million people. Almost 85 to 90% are completely against this action. 3 million people in the middle of winter are not going to go to Ottawa from somewhere else for any reason. So, Fox News was making up news. The Ottawa people, of course, are fed up with the noise, with the honking, with the blockade of downtown, so-called downtown. Whenever I hear the word downtown Ottawa, I always have to say so-called downtown Ottawa. Most truckers are, in Canada are vaccinated, obviously, because most Canadians are vaccinated by far. The truckers also closed the Detroit Windsor bridge, crossing over from one country to another to disrupt traffic. They went into Quebec City, as we know, and are trying to disrupt the Carnival taking place over there. And the Conservative Party of Canada, the government and the Liberals, of course, condemned it. The NDP condemned it. The truckers tried to bring on some sort of an Indigenous component by banging drums and singing songs, but the Indigenous people from the Algonquins who live north of Ottawa came down to Ottawa and said they condemn this also, this sort of cultural appropriation, we'll call it. The protesters also asked the Governor General to kick out Mr. Trump, to kick out Mr. Trudeau. And it's like, what kind of people are they to not know that the Governor General can't just decide to dismiss the Prime Minister? It's like, it gives you the idea that these people are Americans who thought that Trump could overturn the election just because they said so. So, the Governor General doesn't have power to dismiss the government just like that. And so that idea is not going very far. Among the supporters of this truckers boycott are Michael Flynn, who's the convicted henchman of Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson, who's the head honcho of the Fox News, I don't want to call it news, but the Fox entertainment program, right-wing entertainer. Ottawa has lost, and especially the city has lost, tens of millions of dollars because of police overtime, closed businesses, let's say people coming in, tourists such as they are, avoiding the city for now. And, some of the slogans that they were using, you saw them on TV, you saw them on the wall, says, for cowards, freedom is always extremist. In other words, what they're saying is that, if you believe that a government has any rights to control your behavior, then you are a coward. And, in Canada, we've always believed strongly that the government does have a right to limit our freedoms for the benefit of all society, whether this is in setting up public health mandates, to fight COVID, or even to have red lights and stop signs. I mean, I'm wondering why the truckers say, a red light or a stop sign stops their freedom. So why shouldn't they be able to decide if they want to stop at a stop sign or a red light? Or wearing seatbelts. There's another example of limiting your freedom. Why should there be laws mandating seatbelts? I mean, the whole logic that they have of freedom mixes up different concepts of what liberty is and responsibilities are. Mr. Bernier, of course, is somebody who supported the truckers because he obviously needs the votes and he wants to sort of catch a wave, and doing it very well, I would have to say. But most people and even most conservatives don't agree with this whole protest. To give you an idea of who these people are, who are sort of the leaders of it, one, her name is Tamara Lich. She advocated secession for the Western provinces. Another one, BJ Dichter, said that political Islam is rotting our society like syphilis. Another one, Pat King, called COVID a man-made bioweapon, and that international financiers are seeking to depopulate the Anglo-Saxon race. What's an international financier? I'd like you to think about it. It's obviously a kind of a code word for Jews. So Jews are seeking to depopulate the Anglo-Saxon race. What that is, I have no idea. Lots of QAnon and pro-Trump signs are there in the crowd of supporters of these people. These right-wing type of people, unlike in the US, they can't take over the Conservative Party because there is no primary system. We don't have a system of primaries where party members in each constituency choose the candidate. Doesn't work that way. Here, you know, most of the candidates are chosen by members of the committee of the party itself in those particular places. And there's always a veto of the leader of the party to veto some kind of crazies who might sneak in. And so there can't be a groundswell of rebels from the ground up who get their people nominated and then elected, you know, as in the US, Marjorie Greene or Pat Gosar or this Boebert from Colorado. These kind of real extremists could not get nominated, and they certainly couldn't win in our type of a system. The interim leader of the Conservative Party, I think her name is Candace Bergman. She is somebody who was photographed wearing a MAGA hat, you know, Make America Great Again hat. And so you know, it shows that there is definitely a strain or a force within Canada which is sympathetic to the same kind of feelings that brought Trump to power. A far greater number of people are fed up with the restrictions of COVID, for COVID fighting restrictions, the contradictions, the inconsistency of opening and closing, and masks and no masks, and schools and no schools. You know, these kind of things are something gnawing away at all the people. And these acts by the truckers are there to, you know, kind of open that up. So what could be done about these truckers? I think some of us maybe were reading articles about how it's impossible to tow a big truck like that unless the operator of the truck agrees, because they could sort of freeze it in place and then you can never move anything. The tow truck companies in general are not going to tow these trucks because truck towing companies rely on trucks to be towed. And they certainly are not going to tow somebody's truck against their will because they'll lose a customer forever. You know, eventually all these kind of protests do peter out of their own making because people just get bored and fed up. The police are handing out tickets, the police are handing out citations. There have been actions of defacing public property. Of course, we saw the Confederate flags and the Nazi flags that were being flown there, which shows you, you know, what kind of people some of their supporters are. Cutting off their funding is certainly something that they could do. Cutting off the supply of fuel. I saw one picture, maybe you saw it, of these yellow jerry cans filled with fuel that people were taking to fuel up the trucks. But the city passed an ordinance saying you're not allowed to transport fuel in jerry cans because it is dangerous if something spills. They could get tickets for littering. They could get tickets for disturbing the peace. But of course, all of these tickets will be paid for by their supporters. So, you know, it's a bit of a self-defeating strategy, let's say, to try to fight them with tickets alone. More useful would be suspending their licenses to operate a truck because of some violation or other that they could figure out. And injunctions, you know, there was an injunction to get them to stop blowing their horns for 10 days because that was disturbing the peace of the people. So in the meantime, it's a kind of a standoff, and the truckers are determined to stay as long as they possibly can to embarrass the government, but they know for sure that the government is not going to do anything to accommodate their wishes to change the regulations. So it's interesting to see how the standoff will play out. One other point is that this trucking protest in the eyes of the truckers and the right wing has been so successful that they're talking about doing this in the States to try to tie up, cities in the US, especially the liberal-leaning cities, and to embarrass the mayors there, and to embarrass the governors there, and to embarrass the president as well. So this sort of strategy could turn out to be spread, not only in the States, but anywhere around the world where people are fed up with the COVID kind of restrictions. I'll just end by saying that the numbers again are down as far as COVID is concerned. So, and many different countries and many different jurisdictions are loosening up the rules as far as masks are concerned, as far as business openings are concerned, as far as school attendance is concerned. So it may well end up that by countries and provinces loosening their restrictions, that the truckers can say, well, we made our point and the government has listened to us, and so they're loosening restrictions, and so we're the ones who forced them to do it. It all can end up, in other words, being a happy ending on all sides. So yeah, that's my presentation on these different subjects. So if you've got comments or questions about the Olympics or about the conservatives or about the truckers, if you think that's, that they're making their point, if you think it's a constructive way to protest, let me know. Just to again say something that sometimes it's the most radical parts of a demonstration that get the most attention from the press. The the Confederate flag waving and the Nazi flag waving, and the more moderate people who are protesting never seem to get the attention from the press because they're not attention worthy. And this is a kind of a lesson really for all protesters and for the press themselves who seek out this sort of the best-selling story, seek out the most radical protesters because they're the ones who are the most interesting. Okay, so again, thank you so much, and let's see what you have to say, if anything.
So we'll give a minute or two to see if anybody has any questions.
Okay, thanks, Angela. Again, I'll ask people who are listening, if you've got some kind of favorite subject that you want me to cover, I'm always willing to try to accommodate you. I just would like to say I was in Montreal this past weekend, and Saturday night went down to St. Catherine Street, and the number of people who were waiting outside in the cold to get into restaurants on St. Catherine Street was just unbelievable. Lines of people calmly waiting their turn to get into that whole strip of restaurants between, we'll call it between Guy and what, Fort or somewhere there. It was quite impressive to see how many people are willing to stand out in the cold just maybe to experience going into a restaurant, which they haven't experienced in a long time.
So Mr. Dwoskin, I see that there's hold on a second, I'm having some trouble. Steve, please unmute yourself and ask your question to Mr. Dwoskin.
Hi, Steve.
Okay. Hi, Hershey. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yeah, very well.
Okay, Hershey, I just wanted to know if you have any comments about what's happening in Israel with the use of this Pegasus software to spy on Benjamin Netanyahu, his family, journalists, anybody connected with him, without proper warrants and even without due cause.
I think that made the headlines. I was reading an article today in the Israeli press, which I read pretty well every day. It made major headlines. I have to say, I don't know a lot about what Pegasus software is, but it seems to be something that enables people to control it to hack or listen in on communications, whether they're phone communications or computer communications of anybody that they want. So obviously this is a very major, we'll call it invention that can certainly be abused. If I'm not mistaken, the news came out that Israelis were hacked into Mr. Macron, the president of France, of his phone, and they certainly were using it to fight in Iran, to try to find out what all the Iranian scientists were up to. So it's a tool which the Israeli police and Secret Service probably have been using for a while without anybody knowing about it. The news came out that they were hacking into all the people that you mentioned, including Mr. Netanyahu, his son, but not the son who's the well-known son. This is the lesser-known son, and it's a major scandal on the front pages of the Israeli press. Now, obviously, the same rules apply there as here or in the U.S., where you need permission from some judicial authority before and probable cause of maldoing to do this, and obviously this wasn't there. So this is going to play out, and I'm not sure how. I'm not sure who the ultimate responsibility is. I'm not sure if it's the prime minister. I'm not sure if it's the chief of police. I'm not sure who's going to end up taking the blame for this. But I think that it's enough of a scandal that some heads are going to have to roll for this. But I think probably, I'm not sure how you would compare Israel and the US, for example, but in terms of cyber warfare, Israel certainly has been on the top of using cyber warfare to attack its enemies, to find out what its enemies are doing. Those attacks in Iran, the blowing up of their centrifuge production system, the Stuxnet operation. Cyber warfare, or the use of cyber as a tool, is something that Israel is very, very familiar with. And I have no idea what the motivation was for them to use it against Mr. Netanyahu, who isn't in power, and his entourage. So some explanations are going to have to be put out real quick.
Yeah, well, to me, it seems somewhat reminiscent of the abuse of the FISA courts in the United States to unlawfully spy on Donald Trump and his associates. I can tell you some things that I've read about the Pegasus system. It's the most advanced in the world. They could spy on any cell phone anywhere in the world.
Right. The company is called NSO. The company who runs it is called NSO. The one who runs it.
That's right. And it was supposed to be sold under license only government to government to avoid some of these abuses, to be able to
Right.
spy on just anyone. And some of the things that this spyware can do is just with a phone number, it can spy on any cell phone anywhere in the world without planting malware, without having the user having to click on anything. They could access the microphones, the cameras, your address book, all your text messages, and everything that you say and do on your phone before it's encrypted.
It's amazing. Imagine the financial powers that someone who controls that can do, listening in on maybe conversations of CEOs or stock traders or anybody else, how you can monetize something like that.
Yeah, well, it's no wonder that the Abraham Accords were able to come into effect when Israel is in possession of technology like this, that many governments, any government could benefit by, especially those that are under attack by people, terrorist organizations that want to overthrow them.
Yeah, I think as part of the Abraham Accords, I think that Israel gave or sold the use of some of this technology to the United Arab Emirates and even to Saudi Arabia. And I think that, they wanted them to use it against Iran and to prove Israel's value to these places. I think there's proof that they did that. And they also
and it may have been used against Khashoggi. And
yeah, I was going to say exactly that Saudi Arabia used this technology to spy on Khashoggi's phone and to get him to show up in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul, where he was killed and cut up in small pieces.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's yet to be seen where this here is going to go in Israel and how big and how wide this scandal will become. And
it's just the opening.
Become very big.
Yeah, we're at the opening. We're in Act 1, so we'll see where it all goes from here. But it was the front page. It was the front page headline of all of the Israeli papers today.
Well, it's fundamentally shaking the very foundations of free democratic societies. Thanks, Hershey.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Thanks for listening.
You're welcome.
Anyone else, Angela?
I don't see anybody else yet.
Okay.
And I don't see any questions either or raised hands.
Well, in that case, I want to wish everybody a good week. And, I hope to see you all next week. And to go back to my opening subject about the Olympics, enjoy it while it lasts, because, they come on every 4 years. So you don't get a chance to see it again for a while. And we'll see you all next week. So thanks again. And thank you, Angela, for hosting.
Thank you, Mr. Dwoskin, and thank you to everyone listening over the telephone and online. We shall see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.